everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Classic Gamer 74. I'm your host, Anthony Gamer, and in today's episode we are having another AVP of Frogger. If you are a returning viewer, thank you for stopping by, and if you are a new viewer, welcome to my channel. Now let me explain what AVP means. It stands for Arcade versus Port. Now, back in the 80s and into the 90s, an arcade game would be ported out to various home consoles. And of course, a lot of times the arcade game would be slightly different than the ported version of the game. So what we do in these AVP episodes is we compare and contrast the arcade game to its various ports. And we're going to be doing just that in today's episode with Frogger, which was a huge hit in the arcade, and the ports themselves were pretty much iconic as well. So let's get started. Okay, now Frogger was first published in 1981, and it was developed by Konami and originally published by Sega. In North America, it was published jointly by Sega and Gremlin Industries, and it was released in Japan on June 5th, 1981, and in North America on October 23rd, 1981. The objective of the game is quite simple. Well, in theory anyway. You're trying to guide a frog across several lanes of traffic, across a raging river, and get him to each of the lily pads on the top of the screen. As simple as the game is, and you got to admit the concept is pretty easy, the game is quite fun and can get really action-packed, especially in higher levels when the traffic moves a lot quicker, and then you have to deal with snakes and alligators and all kinds of fun stuff. And don't forget those pesky turtles that sometimes will decide to go underwater with you on their back. And for some strange reason, the frog isn't able to swim. Never did quite figure that part out. One thing about the game that really does stick out in a lot of people's memories, mine included, is that really cool theme song that you hear at the beginning of the game. Now, if you're from Japan, you're way ahead of the rest of us on this one. But for those of us that are not from Japan, today's trivia question is, what is the name of that song? You think you know the answer? Wait till the end and see if you're correct. Alright, so let's get started with the arcade first, of course. As you can see, the first level is not too bad. You are trying to get across the highway, and the traffic is moving kind of slowly, and then you make your way across the river. See how those turtles like to dunk underwater sometime? Now remember, in most versions of this game, you cannot let yourself be taken to the edge of the screen. If you do, you will die. In some ports, you are able to actually do that depending on the settings. Now, you can pick up that female frog, and when you take her to the lily pads, you get extra points. Of course, you see that I just screwed up. Anyway, so the first level is relatively easy for the most part, although it does take a lot of practice, and I'm a little out of practice because I hadn't really played this game in many years. But once you get the hang of it, the game is pretty easy for the most part, at least on the first level. As time goes on, the game does get quite difficult. But yet, the fun factor of this game is pretty much never-ending, as this is going to be one of those games you are probably going to be playing over and over again for many years to come. I know I have. Probably one of the most well-known ports of all has to be the Atari 2600 version. Parker Brothers licensed this game so that it could release it to pretty much every home console at that time. So let's start off with the Atari 2600 port of Frogger. What you'll notice on this particular version of the game is that I switched the difficulty to regular so that you are able to ride the logs or turtles or lily pads or whatever you're on around the screen, which of course, like I said, is something you cannot do on the arcade version. Generally speaking, no matter where you are playing this game, whether it be on one of these home consoles or on a computer, the game itself is pretty much the same, only the graphics may be slightly different depending on which console you're playing. The Magnavox Odyssey 2 usually was not a game system that got a lot of ports, and when it did, usually the ports weren't that good. If you want to see a good example of that, look at their port of Popeye. However, believe it or not, the Frogger port wasn't really that bad. Because of the limitations of the Magnavox Odyssey 2, they actually separated the game into two separate screens. So you had the first screen in which you were trying to get across the highway, and then you had the second screen of getting across the river. Overall, I would say the game is really not all that bad. It certainly isn't as bad as the Apple II. However, I don't really think this got a lot of attention because of the fact that most people that own a Magnavox Odyssey 2 weren't purchasing it for the ports. They were generally purchasing it for the original games that came with the system. In a few weeks now, I'm going to be having an episode just dedicated to the Magnavox Odyssey 2, but for now you can see their port of Frogger, which really isn't that bad, all things considering the limitations of this home console. From that point forward, just about every game console made their own port of Frogger. As a matter of fact, the game itself has sold almost 20 million copies worldwide, including 5 million in the United States. So, let's check out some of the other ports of this iconic game. Not surprisingly, the Atari 5200 version of the game has the same quality of graphics and, dare I say, realism that the Atari 8-bit had. The colors are a bit brighter on this version, don't really have the same richness and darkness of the Atari 8. However, as with every game that was made for the Atari 5200, the game itself cannot be beat, as the Atari 5200, even though with all its issues that it did have in the hardware department, more than made up for it in the beauty and overall effect that the software had. What truly was a big surprise for me was how much I enjoyed the ColecoVision version, I'm really getting good at saying that, of Frogger. The bright graphics that, of course, we are all used to with the ColecoVision, and believe it or not, the controls were actually pretty fluid. I was really truly surprised on how well this game came off. Although, to be honest, it really shouldn't have been that much of a surprise, as Parker Brothers themselves were pretty good at making games, no matter what system they were making it for. The Intellivision version itself wasn't that bad, although to be honest with you, I did have a little bit of trouble steering the Frog with that disc. But overall, I would have to say this also was a winner as far as the ports go. So, for the Super NES, Frogger meets the world of 16-bit, and what a world it is. As you can see, the game itself is pretty much the same. You have Frogger trying to get across the highway, then get across the logs and the turtles to make his way to the lily pads in these caves. But to be honest with you, with the new hyped up graphics that the Super NES had, this game was brought into a modern age and would appeal to the next generation of gamers. On the flip side, however, the Sega Genesis version tried as hard as possible to make the game look exactly like the arcade, and which it did. To be honest with you, this was something that no other game system before had been able to do. However, the next version of the game would be almost a total reimagine of a classic. And the final one for today is the PlayStation 1 version. Many of you that are familiar with PS1 know that it was quite a common practice to take old games, or vintage games, and make them playable or appealing to the modern gamer. PlayStation used to do this quite a bit with other games, but probably one of the best ones that they did was Frogger. As you can see, this game with 3D rendering and pretty much overall is just a great game. Many of my former students at that time were surprised to learn that this was actually an old game, that it had actually been made before. And I told them, yeah, this game came out when I was a kid. So it was kind of interesting to see a game that had been around for so many years then being appealing to a next generation of game players. And the answer to today's trivia question is, what is the name of the theme song for Frogger? And the answer is Inu no Omawarisan. translated as The Dog Policeman, which is a very well-known children's song in Japan. Well, that brings us to the end of another exciting episode of Classic Gamer 74. I really hope you all enjoyed it. Did you like it? Well, if you did, let me know by smashing that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tickle the bell icon so that you'll be notified when I upload new episodes. In our next episode, we'll see how Frogger held up in the computer world. Was this game successfully ported to different computers around the world? Well, you'll have to wait till the next episode and find out. Well, until next time, this has been Anthony Gamer, and I will see you all in the next episode. Until then, have yourselves a great day. Goodbye.